Hey everybody, it's Mark. Before we get going with today's episode, I just wanted to jump on and let you know that today's episode is going to be part one of a two-part episode focusing on Volume 1 of The Sacrificers by Rick Remender and Max Fiumara. For this book club episode, my buddy Jimmy Teigen joined me to talk about The Sacrificers, and we had an excellent discussion. This book really invites the reader to explore certain themes that recur in literary narratives, religious narratives, cultural narratives of all kinds. And so this conversation went deep, but as a result, it also went kind of long. We didn't know it at the time that we recorded it, but in editing, I decided I'm going to go ahead and break it up into two parts. Today, we'll be discussing issues 1 and 2, the first two chapters of The Sacrificers from Volume 1, and then next week, when we come back with actually a shorter episode, we will have issues 3 through 6, which is where the first volume of The Sacrificers ends. This first volume of The Sacrificers is masterful storytelling. And while on the surface, this podcast is a podcast about comic books and graphic novels, really, what this podcast is a conversation about stories and storytelling, and how we make meaning for ourselves out of those stories that are part of our arts and our culture. You know, this past week, between when Jimmy and I sat down to record this episode and the Monday morning when this episode will come out, the legendary newsman Bill Moyers passed away. And that reminded me of a project, certainly relevant to this discussion, that he was involved in hosting a documentary series for PBS back in the late 80s called Joseph Campbell and the Power of Myth, that dives into the idea of how we have used storytelling throughout all of human history to convey and make meaning. And that's a theme that's been on my mind quite a bit, actually, in reviewing The Sacrificers. And I think sometime probably over the course of the next week, between when this episode comes out and when part 2 is released, I'll probably go back and spend some time revisiting The Power of Myth. I hope you enjoyed today's episode. Jimmy and I certainly had a good time having our conversation about this book and about the other stories throughout culture that it reminds us of. And there may be others that you think of, too, that we didn't take any time to discuss. So hit me up at graphicnovelapostle@gmail.com and let me know what you think. And now, enjoy the show.
Once a month, when the moon reaches its highest point in the sky and the wild creatures call out to the night, he emerges from a private sanctuary in an undisclosed location outside of Little Rock, Arkansas. Arrayed in his priestly vestments, carrying forth the good news that comic books and graphic novels aren't just for kids, that they aren't just mass and spandex superheroes, that storytelling in a graphic format can be so much more. He is the Graphic Novel Apostle.
Hello and welcome to the Graphic Novel Apostle podcast. I'm your host, Mark Ohrenberger, and I am so happy to be back here with you as always. Always excited when we've got a book club episode, and that's what we have today. I've got my guest, Jimmy Teigen, who's a good friend of mine with me. Jimmy, how are you today, my friend?
Man, I am great. I am thrilled to be here and talk about this graphic novel.
Well, I'm looking forward to it too. So the book we're going to be discussing today is The Sacrificers, Volume 1. To run through the credits quickly on that book, it was written by Rick Remender. Art was done by Max Fiumara. Colors by Dave McCaig. Letters by Rus Wooton. This was published by Image Comics. And Volume 1 covers issues 1 through 6 of The Sacrificers. They were published between August of 2023 and January of 24. And then this first volume was collected into the book we'll be discussing today in April of last year. Now, this series has been still ongoing. They just had issue 15 last month as we record this in May of 2025. Well, it's June of 2025 now. May was when issue 15 came out. And I don't know whether the series continues on after that or not. That is the conclusion of Volume 3 of the book. And so I'll be looking forward to seeing whether there's more to come. Truth be told, Jimmy, I haven't read past Volume 1. I know you have 1 and 2, correct?
Correct, yeah.
Well, cool. All right, let me give the folks just a little idea of what this book is all about. And so I'm going to read to you the blurb that appears on the back of Volume 1 of Sacrificers, give you an idea of the story, and then we'll just talk a little bit before we get into the actual issues. So that reads, "Tomorrow is a harmonious paradise, thanks to the 5 families who make everything perfect, for the price of 1 child per household. Now, as that bill comes due, a son expected to give everything for a family that never loved him, and an affluent daughter determined to destroy a utopia, must unite to end one generation's unnaturally protected reign. And Jimmy, when I first knew of this series, before I'd even picked it up and looked through it or read any of it, I thought, this is one I want to talk to my buddy Jimmy Teigen about. For a couple of different reasons. One, you are an English teacher. Mm-hmm. Yep. And also, you are formerly a minister and someone who has done quite a bit of study in the area of theology. And I know you study a lot about Old Testament particularly.
Yeah, I really enjoy Old Testament. I don't know if I'd say if I study it a lot. It is a well that I love to go back to over and over and just enjoy reading Scripture as literature. And I think that it is beautifully written. And like I said, it's just you just can constantly go back and find new things. And so it's neat to come and read something else and then see how that enlightens you or kind of how it changes your lens of how you read other things.
Sure. Well, and the first time that I heard anything about the premise of this book, the idea that the gods would keep a world perfect for the mortals for this price that they have to pay, this sacrifice that they have to make of a child, of course, that immediately brings to mind something scriptural, brings to mind the story of the binding of Isaac from Genesis chapter 22. And then additionally, we'll talk about this more as we move on, but the other thing that stands out in my mind is that short story that certainly I read in school, I imagine you probably did too growing up, called The Lottery. We'll talk about that story in a little more detail in a bit, but I think most of our listeners, whether they know it by that title or not, will recognize it. That was written by Shirley Jackson, and I actually just learned this week. That was published in the New Yorker magazine.
I read that as well when I was getting ready for this. And just interesting, it seems like middle school, early high school, these are things that kids kind of, that seems like the appropriate time to bring this kind of literature into things. Kids are asking those questions. They're just curious as they learn more about different cultures. It seems like every now and then those stories are going to pop back up. Of course, right now, it's been a while, but The Hunger Games is certainly one that I think a lot of people are familiar with.
Yeah, so you teach sixth grade.
Yeah.
Have you always taught sixth grade?
Yeah, I taught 7th and 8th grade 1 year, but 6th grade is home base for me.
Okay.
Yeah.
So longtime listeners of this show, and Jimmy, I know you've been a good listener, so I appreciate that.
Yeah.
You may have heard this before, but longtime listeners of this show will know that one of the tenets of the graphic novel Apostle is that middle school is torture. Why do we have to live through middle school? And yet you choose to exist there.
Yeah.
What is that all about? Tell me what the middle school mind is like.
I love teaching middle school because it is a place of innocence and yet an incredible place of depth. I'll be teaching stories or I'll just be teaching kids things, and they are so hungry and eager, and it's almost like a desert in some ways, because you bring them water and they're like, oh my goodness, we've never seen this, we've never heard this before, we love it. And yet at the same time, it's kind of like a jungle where it's like there's all these ideas and it's just the so many different things that are going through their brains, I think, and you're just trying to get through this jungle to get to whatever it is you're trying to get to. So it's a little bit desert, a little bit jungle, and a whole lot of emotions. And I just think it's an incredible environment to be in every day. I really do enjoy it.
Okay. Well, my hat is off to you. I'm glad that there are people made like you, Jimmy, because, man, I couldn't do it. I cringe when I think back to myself as a 6th, 7th, 8th grader, even into 9th, I suppose. 6th grade is a little more innocent, maybe.
Yep.
My school system that I grew up in moved to a middle school that was 6th, 7th, and 8th from a K through 8 elementary school.
Yeah.
But when they started to make that transition, they did it when I was going into the 6th grade, and they kept for that first year the 6th grade in the elementary school. So I went to 6th grade in an elementary, and then 7th and 8th in a middle school. And there's a pretty serious demarcation in my mind there. You know, in 6th grade, we studied Egyptian history.
Yeah.
And I was just like fascinated by ancient Egypt. And I was sort of in that like, I want to drink it up mindset. And you're telling me about, I've heard of like King Tut from cartoons and stuff like that. But now you're telling me about like, Osiris and some of these different ancient Egyptian gods. And ideas of mythology, and then I start to think about some of my religious upbringing. And I remember even as a kid, it striking me then that like, okay, so the difference between mythology and these stories that I've heard growing up in church, boy, some of them kind of sound alike a little bit, And so starting to wrestle with those ideas, it's kind of a time of awakening. But it was a more innocent time. And then I think about 7th and 8th grade, man, I was a miserable jerk. And I was one of the good kids. Like, oh, terrible. But you do okay there.
Yeah, so I teach English class, and then I also teach Bible, and that is a lot of kind of my history. That's my education, are those two worlds. I really appreciate. I'm thankful for the way God has shaped me for the last 20 years to teach those two subjects in particular. 6th grade is a big entry point for our school. And so I have some kids who have been in Sunday school and gone to church their entire life, and they know their Bible knowledge is amazing. And then I have other kids who have never spent time inside of a church building hardly at all. And to blend those two and to try to teach them, give them scripture and just give them a foundation, that's the joy of my job. And just seeing how those two groups interact and to maybe share a Bible story that some of them have never heard before. And then others, they know the story, but then I say, look how this connects, or look at this aspect of the story that you've never noticed before, and it can come alive for both groups. That is, like I said, it's the desert and it's the jungle at the same time. And that is just for a person who grew up really thinking Indiana Jones was the coolest.
Okay.
That's a great job.
Yeah.
It's a lot of fun.
I like that. Very cool. Well, talk to me a little bit about what you teach in Bible to a 6th grade audience. What does the curriculum look like?
Great. I go through Genesis through Revelation. And we look at the Bible as 5 acts. We try to connect the story. Like I said, some of my kids, they know many Bible verses. Elementary school, they memorized a verse here and a verse there. But I want them to see that Scripture is one unified story. And it is broken up into 5 different acts. Perfect creation, the fall, waiting for the king is here, and creation restored. The Bible is a great restoration story. It is a redemption story, God reclaiming things that belong to Him, and then fixing things. And that's kind of my backbone of my curriculum. But then also just some key key phrase that I use a lot is trust the story. If the great story of Scripture is that God is redeeming us, God is reclaiming and restoring, God's fixing broken things, we need to trust that story. And so God is fixing me. God is fixing relationships. God is fixing communities. And He's using us to partner with Him to fix those things.
Well, let's talk a little bit about English then. Because
Okay.
I understand you teach more like language arts than literature at the 6th grade level. Is that right?
That's right. I'm the grammar guy. So nouns, verbs, compound sentences, prepositions. I am the guy that it says we're doing away with run-on sentences. And can you underline this once and underline this thing twice? And just understanding how the language is used. But then also we get into how to organize paragraphs, how to write stories. And that's really fun. In order to be able to write stories, of course, you have to be able to read stories and kind of go through some themes. But I kind of deal more with the mechanical side of it as opposed to thematically so much. That we have another teacher that does a great job with that, but I'm more the mechanical guy.
Okay, so are your students taking separate language arts and literature kind of classes? Or
They've got a reading class and then they have a writing class. Most places, that'll be the same teacher.
Sure.
But we have it separated, and we've done that for 10 years, and it seems to work well, so I think we're going to keep doing it.
Well, Jimmy, I know I like you for a lot of reasons, but the grammar ninny that's built deep down inside of me is just one of those reasons. So I don't want to get overly controversial here on this podcast, but let me start by asking you, I think, a very important question. Where do you stand on the Oxford comma?
I believe it has a place. I'm a fan. Uh-oh.
Okay, well, I want to push you on this a little bit, because I also believe it has a place. The place is everywhere that you have the opportunity to place an Oxford comma.
Yes. Okay. Good.
Okay.
Good. We're in agreement.
Oh, good.
I was nervous there. The Oxford comma is obviously the hill you're willing to die on. I will say that the semicolon is the hill that I reside on. And I say it is way underutilized in our society and in our writings today. And I tell the kids every year, I'm like, one of these days I'm going to have a shirt and just put a big semicolon on it, and I'm going to wear it around. It's more than just early 2000s emojis. Remember that when we would do the semicolon for the winking?
Oh, sure.
For the winking smile? No, semicolons have a place, and it's important. Use them. Bring back the semicolon.
Jimmy, you've touched on another area that's an area of deep conflict for me, because I also love the semicolon. I think it is so useful in connecting sentences that you don't want to break up into two sentences, because you want those ideas to pair together. But here's where this becomes an area of conflict for me. I also love the writings of Kurt Vonnegut. I think he is a brilliant writer, brilliant storyteller. I think he has such an interesting way of looking at the world. And yet, I was actually just reading this last night, some of his writing where he talks about language and talks about how to write sentences and that kind of thing. And he talks about the semicolon does nothing except prove to people that you went to college.
Yes.
and that you should, whenever you find a semicolon, kill it. And that hurts me.
Yeah, that hurts me as well. No, I'm a fan of the semicolon. I think it has a place for middle school writing, high school, college, any kind of writing you're going to use. Whenever you have two thoughts and you want to put them together, not just comma fanboys, people, semicolons work too.
All right. We can move forward, Jimmy.
All right, great. The Sacrificers.
Well, let's do that. Yeah, let's get into the Sacrificers. And so there are 6 issues in this first volume of the Sacrificers, which leave us in a place, of course we'll get to, but leave us in a place by the end where the story has to continue, because It's not concluded. But it's a good wrapping up place, I think, for the for the time being, for a volume to end, knowing that it's going to continue. A lot of comic books, when they are published, will have, they've got the title of the comic book, and then each individual issue has its own little subtitle, and so it'll be, I want to say that it's the Fantastic Four issue number 48, which is where my favorite character in all of comics, the Silver Surfer, is introduced. And that is subtitled something like The Coming of Galactus. And so you get that little subtitle. These issues weren't, but I gave them my own subtitles. And so I'll share those. Okay. And so for chapter 1, I've got this as One Simple Sacrifice. And let's get into it. So our story opens on a clear night in this little cozy country house. And a father of this really lovely looking blue feathered bird people family are sitting around their dinner table, and they're saying a prayer before their evening meal. I actually want to look at those first couple of pages together. And we start with the outside view of this little country house. And it's nighttime, and the moon is illuminating the night sky, and everything has got kind of these blue hues to it. And the roof is like a grassy thatched kind of roof on this house. And I can't help but conjuring up in my own mind sort of images of like the Shire and the Hobbit hole at Bag End.
Exactly. That was the same story I thought of. Yeah.
And there were a couple of other places where I actually want to talk to you a little bit about Tolkien as well as we go through this, and The Lord of the Rings. Well, let me ask you first, though. How do you feel about those books?
Uh-oh.
Oh, we're getting into someplace bad now, aren't we?
Yeah. I have tried to read Tolkien several times, and it's just too deep. It's too much. There's too much information, too much in depth. Sad to say, I have never made it through an entire Tolkien story.
Whoa, not even The Hobbit?
That is correct, and I don't think, if I can be honest here, I have never made it through a Lord of the Rings movie without taking a nap.
Oh, Jimmy.
I know that hurts, and the people who are listening right now, I apologize now. I'll try better.
Jimmy, I don't want to make you look like a monster on my podcast, but
that's rough, I know.
Okay. Well, I'm going to forgive that, but I will say, though, I absolutely do appreciate, I don't know whether it's Tolkien or Tolkien, I guess I've heard it both ways, but I do appreciate that there's a point where I love how he has developed this deep, deep lore, but I don't want to read it all. He has a book called The Silmarillion, which, you read the Lord of the Rings books, and they reference all of these, battles and past kings and all this kind of stuff, and it's built on something that came before. Well, the Silmarillion gets into the history, this whole long history of all these kings and queens and wars of ages and that kind of thing in Middle-earth. And I tried to read that. I tried really, really hard to read that. And at some point, it got to where I was like, okay, now I'm like reading the book of Numbers from the Old Testament. Now I'm reading Leviticus. That's not pleasure reading.
See, I'll read the books of Leviticus and Numbers all day long before I jump into that.
Okay.
If we want to talk about his buddy C.S. Lewis and his Out of the Silent Planet series or Narnia or anything like that, that's great. But Tolkien's just too deep for me.
Oh, man.
So,
that
sorry.
Out of the Silent Planet. Is that what's called his space trilogy?
Yep.
Okay.
Yeah.
I've never read any of that. I grew up on the Narnia books and just absolutely love those and still do even as an adult. But, well, to go back to the Hobbit hole, though, it does conjure something like this warm feeling. And I actually just want to read a little bit of, the prayer, because this is our first introduction to this world. And if you hadn't read the, solicit for the new comic as it was coming out, or read the blurb on the back of this book and just picked it up, you don't know what this world is going to look like. And so as we're starting to zoom in on this house and we have these little word bubbles that come out where we're hearing the father's dinner time prayer. And he says, "None learned until you taught. None smiled until you laughed. None grew until you nourished. None knew charity until your light guided. Great fathers and mothers, through your divine grace, we know only harmony, peace, and love. No evil to threaten, no temptation to lure. No plague to bring us low. Accept our gratitude, obedience, and humble sacrifice, gladly given, in return for our time on your perfect world." And just as it seems like he's wrapping up this prayer, which it also sounds like it's what would be the word, like a doxology or something like that. It's something that would be repeated.
Yes, yeah.
He's interrupted by a sound, like a scratching kind of noise. And the father immediately looks up from his revere, and he looks outside the window. And there is, what would you say, maybe like a teenage blue bird person as well?
Yep.
And, he's got like 4 little kids around his dinner table who are joining him in the prayer. And he's got his wife here as well. And then outside the window, there is this teenage character who we're going to come to know as Pigeon. And the father is immediately enraged when he just sees Pigeon outside the window. So, we don't exactly know what's going on here, but he starts taking off his belt and going outside, and he's chasing Pigeon back to this barn, and he takes off his belt all the way and just starts beating this child, just whipping him with this belt brutally, in ways that, honestly, it's well rendered on the page, but it's a little hard to look at.
Yeah, yep, absolutely.
And as he does, he's telling the child that he's being a selfish boy, and it makes some reference to like, you do this in front of your own mother while she's trying to enjoy dinner. Like, he had no business even being in the view of the family. Well, also during that prayer, though, we had seen one of the small children. We'll learn her name is Beatrice, and she's a sister of Pigeon, like sneaking a biscuit from the table and putting it in her apron that she's wearing. And then late at night, when the beating is done, basically, and Pigeon has gone to sleep on some hay out in this barn by the pigs, and he's got like a burlap sack, basically, that he's using for a blanket, Beatrice comes out and brings him some of these rolls from the dinner table. And she says to him, "Thank you."
Yeah, I thought that was that little bubble, the thank you, the first time I read it, because they're both looking at each other and both of their mouths are open. And I thought, oh, Pigeon is telling his little sister, "Thank you for this food that you've given me." But no, it's actually her saying thank you to him, which is a great lead-in, a great intro of saying, what is she doing saying thank you to this guy? This obviously a brother that is living in the barn. What other than just the title of the sacrificers, what is it that she is thanking him for?
Yeah, that's right. Because you would expect, like your brain would naturally expect the tail of that word balloon to lead toward the mouth of Pigeon, because he's the one who's being given something that Beatrice took some risk. Dad obviously is a very violent guy, and so she took some risk in stealing these rolls away from the dinner table and sneaking out in the night to carry them out to him.
Yeah.
And yet she's thanking him. So it's a great little vignette to open this book and leave us with some questions immediately.
Yeah.
Well, we turn the page, and here we get and Jimmy, as you and I were talking a little bit before we started recording, I think you questioned whether this was like another cover of some kind, basically, for like a second issue. Mm-hmm. And it's not. It's just it is sort of a new title treatment that appears inside this first chapter. And it's this gorgeous page. And of course, listeners will know I always try to put up some pages of the art to give people an idea of what this book looks like that we're describing on our Instagram page at Graphic Novel Apostle. And this page will be one that I put up there. And it's got the text of the words, the sacrificers, over top. And then it looks like a compass with a globe kind of in the middle and these different types of kingdoms and a creature that looks like a dragon or something like that in one of them. And Jimmy, you were talking about Narnia. This actually kind of reminds me of in some of the Prince Caspian books or the Voyage of the Dawn Treader books that I had as a kid. It would have that map that it showed where the Dawn Treader was going to go and there be dragons on one place. It has that feeling.
Yeah, I agree. And it really helps kind of see like, all right, this is the world that we're in. And you can note the contrast. You've got the world kind of is governed by the light, the sun. And then on the other side, you've got the contrast with the moon and the different phases of the moon and how this world kind of is in a balance between those two. And I think that's kind of the point of this, is that all of this world is governed by sun and moon. And as we learn now, as we're then moving forward, we're talking about the gods. You've got the god of the sun and the god of the moon and how this world is in that balance within that relationship.
Yeah. And so the name for this world is Harlos. And then it has also what looks like an unfurled scroll with some text that's indecipherable. I would imagine that these are figures that are probably made up specifically for the book here, which also reminded me of Tolkien a little bit with, him inventing like elfish languages. But it immediately puts us in a world with a deep lore of its own.
Yes.
And I gotta tell you, I'm a little surprised, Jimmy. I thought you were going to tell me that you loved the deep lore kind of stuff. And frankly, on my first reading through this book, I think I bogged myself down a little bit in trying to make sure I understood who the different gods were and what their relationships were to one another. We're going to see pretty quickly, and we're about to move into this land of the gods that, much like the gods in Greek and Roman mythology, they're petty, and they are always having affairs with one another, and their relationships are broken and mended, and some are at war. And I felt like in my head I needed to try and keep a diagram of all that stuff. And the second time I read through this book, I enjoyed it so much more because I realized that wasn't essential. All I needed to know was they all kind of had the knives out for each other, but I didn't need to know particularly which one hated which one and for what reason.
Yeah, I think it was the third read. I went through and just kind of looked at the names, and I enjoy doing that. I don't think they just randomly picked names. There's got to be a reason that she is named that. Beatrice, why Beatrice? And I think it was more just a nod, like these gods, you're going to have a sun god, but then what are you going to name him and why that? And the character we're about to be introduced to is Saluna. And I thought, what a great name for someone who is the offspring of the god of the sun and the god of the moon.
It's perfect.
Great name. Whoever came up with that one, well done.
Yeah, and when you say it out loud, it doesn't strike you in quite the same way as when you read it. So Sol Luna is Soluna. So Sol for sun and Luna for the moon. And she is the child of the sun and the moon, the king and queen gods of this world. And let's talk about Soluna, because we're being introduced to her right now.
Yep.
And she is going to become one of our key point of view characters. We're going to follow her story, and we're going to follow Pigeon's story side by side, and then ultimately where they blend together. But do you want to talk a little bit about that character design of Soluna?
Yes, she lives with Dad. We learn that fairly quickly. And she is struggling. I think that's safe to say. She feels like I am ready to be of age to sit at the grown-up table, but Dad has me still confined, and there is something going on that Dad has not let me in on. And I'm Daddy's little girl. I get everything that I want, and so how dare he keep something from me? And she seems to hold up her mom as this somebody who kind of fought the system. Yeah, and kind of holds Mom up as this person who has rebelled, and I don't know, that's again, she just represents kind of the contrast between the sun and the moon.
Yeah, well, and Soluna is 18 years old. And we are coming into this story, we're going to learn pretty quickly, at a time called the harvest, which comes around once every 20 years. And so the harvest has not occurred in her lifetime. She knows something about it. She knows some version of the harvest. But we're going to figure out that she does not understand exactly what this harvest is all about. And she does feel that, at 18, she's of age and ought to be brought into this assembly of the gods and the lords of this realm. To talk a little more, though, artistically about the design of the character, what a cool design.
Absolutely.
She's got, we would say she's a redhead, I guess, but it's this orange fire that makes up her hair. And she's got a blue-gray sort of hue to her skin and on her face. And I really like the way they did this because they don't give us a full front-on view of her face for quite a while into the book. And when we see that there's some kind of like these lines that are contrasting with the light and the dark colors on her face. But when we finally see her full on, we see that her face is like this dark gray blue with like a crescent moon of light blue that rings from sort of the center of her forehead over one eye and down to the point of her chin, which, reflects the moon part of her mother. So cool.
Yeah. Beautifully drawn.
Yeah.
Just a great connection of with the name, with then how she looks, and they really sold it. She's the offspring of the sun and the moon.
Yeah. Well, she's also got a little pet that's with her, and I guess this pet sort of reads like a dog and sort of reads like a pig and kind of has like a short aardvark snout a little bit. It's maybe kind of ugly and kind of cute at the same time. We're going to learn that pet's name is Doto, which, made me think of Toto. And I don't know how much Soluna is intended to be. Maybe she is in some ways a Dorothy, Wizard of Oz kind of character. Honestly, I hadn't really thought about that until talking about Toto out loud for the first time right now.
Okay. Yeah, I hadn't thought of that at all.
But anyway, we're going to learn that in her efforts to figure out more about this world of the gods, she does a lot of sneaking around, a lot of eavesdropping. She's not afraid to sort of flex her importance in front of some of the servants in this area, which, there's something kind of precocious about her that makes you want to like her. And then she does sort of mistreat some of the servants that she encounters and things, which makes me want to dislike her then. And so, she's complicated.
Yep. Yeah, absolutely. I think you've nailed that.
So we're going to next be introduced to our sun god, whose name is Rokos, Rokos, which, Jimmy, I couldn't quite put my finger on. It sounds like a good name for a sun god, but there was nothing from language that stood out to me that would make that something that you'd go, oh yeah, that's the sun god.
Yeah, I spent a while trying to figure out where did that name come from. Maybe it was just one that they thought was neat. Regardless, yeah, I think he personifies, how most of us would think the sun god would be. Powerful, big, loud,
yeah,
arrogant.
And he's got that fire head as well, too, with kind of long flowing hair. Like I think people often, conjure images of God in their mind. And this god's long flowing hair happens to all be made of fire. It's a really stunning personification.
Yeah. And just his attitude. He's fiery.
Yes.
He's an overbearing dad. He is got his foot down on her. And it gives the impression right away that this is the guy in charge. He rules by an iron fist.
Yeah, that's right. And in this first introduction that we get to Rokos, where Soluna is spying on him, and he is in his, palace area with his love, who is not Luna. It's another woman, another one of the, representatives of the gods. And they're bickering, and of course Soluna is eavesdropping on them. But they're bickering about whether Rokos is spending too much time with Luna, going too often to see his wife. And so, we are thrown right away into the idea that, okay, these gods are something like those Greek gods where, Zeus was constantly, looking for different loves, and that there was always drama that was in high activity between the gods.
Yeah, this is definitely not a monotheistic tale. This is more in mythology, concepts. And right away, we know that this is a different story altogether of you've got that pigeon family praying to the gods, and now all of a sudden we're there with the gods and seeing that contrast.
Yeah. Well, and also from that, liturgical style prayer that the Father opened with, it gave this really beautiful image of the gods, like they were these loving, generous, altruistic beings. And then, of course, the first time we see them, we see that they are, in fact, petty and very, very human.
Yeah.
And maybe not altogether worthy of praise.
Mm-hmm.
So we'll jump back now to the realm of this blue bird family. And they're dealing with the next morning, kind of the aftermath of their night before. And we see the Father, and we start to get a little more of a multidimensional picture of him. At first, he just seemed like this rage monster, when he went out there and was beating Pigeon. And you can see that he feels guilty about it in the morning. And the mother is laying in bed next to the Father, and she's turned away, and she's, whether or not she's crying, I can't quite tell, but she's certainly in some anguish. And she's saying, couldn't he have just eaten dinner with us this one night? And the Father says, would have just made it worse. And we can start to tell he doesn't like this any more than the rest of the family does. But he knows that Pigeon is going to have to be a sacrifice, and that there is going to come a time, and I'm not sure whether he knows or not how soon that time is upon them. I think he does, that Pigeon is going to be taken away from the family. And so he's isolated this child and left him in a barn and mistreated him his whole life, maybe to make it easier for Pigeon to be rid of this family and for this family to be rid of Pigeon.
Yeah. But then as the foreman, we learn right away that's who the character is who is coming to pick up these sacrificers, the sacrifice child from the family, when the foreman enters their property, Dad speaks up right away and says, I'm afraid we have none to give. Our sacrifice died last winter.
Yeah, he's immediately trying to hide Pigeon. He's trying to protect him.
Yeah, and so there's an element of compassion there, or a protection. A dad mode kicks in of saying, this is my kid, even though I have mistreated him, or we haven't done right by him. I still don't want to give my child to this foreman, to whatever is going to happen.
Well, I think he knows he's butting up against the inevitable, but at the same time, he's going to take at least a couple of shots.
Yeah.
He's going to make some effort to prevent this from happening. And you reference the character of the foreman, who now appears on their property. And so we don't get his name right away. We'll learn later that he's called the foreman. But in my notes, when I was first introduced to him, I started referring to him as the harvester, because he is the character who is going to come around and collect children from their families, bind them up with iron, not only shackles on their wrist and things, but like these iron braces that hold their arms down to the side, and link them all together with chains and lead them off to wherever it is that they're going. And he is also a striking figure. So the foreman has, this long black robe, and he has this black sort of metallic like armor, but his head, and I will tell you that at first I thought this was just his head, is the head of Anubis, the Egyptian god of death. I was looking at it and I was like, I know this head shape. I know this from somewhere. And, then it struck me, I just Googled, I was like, okay, God with cat head. And it turned out it's more of a jackal head, I guess. So it turns out, we're going to learn later, this is like a helmet and a mask. Mm-hmm. But it's the god of death, which is very fitting for the role this character plays. And, of course, eventually, Pigeon has to be given to the harvester, to the foreman. And he's going to join these other children who are already shackled and chained behind the foreman and go on with them. And we have this really emotional scene where the father is almost like kind of ready to put up more of a fight even. And the mother is begging for mercy, and some of the children are starting to get in on it too. And at one point, the harvester, almost like a cruel joke, the foreman says, looks at all the children who are kind of hiding behind their mother's arms and her apron as well. And he says to them, would you prefer that I choose another, so as not to take Pigeon? And it's Pigeon who pipes up here. And he says, "Stop. It's me. It's my duty. I'm the sacrificer." And, the kids are crying out. But sure enough, the father sort of relents at this point too. And Pigeon goes and says that he's going willingly. And Beatrice, yells to him as he's being led off, "I love you." And Pigeon sort of turns and looks over his shoulder in a really touching panel. "I love you too."
Yeah, it's interesting. He is referred to as the sacrificer. He's the boy. He is, I feel like there was something else. Oh, just the foreman says, "Shackle the sacrifice." This character is not given a name.
Yeah, that's right. And, we've been calling him Pigeon because later on some of the other characters will call him Pigeon, but that's just a name they assign to him because he's a bird.
Right. And it is definitely just everything about him to this point is less than. He is viewed as less than, and this will come back to this point later on, but as the one who is to be the sacrificer and it being his duty, he was disconnected from his culture and viewed as less than amongst all of the people, it seems like, other than Beatrice.
Yeah.
And I guess the rest of the family, there's still a connection there, but not enough where I'm willing to stand up to Dad.
Yeah.
And fight the system.
Well, yeah, maybe. Although Beatrice and her other siblings who aren't Pigeon are really small children.
Yeah.
It's Dad who ultimately, he's prepared to make some excuses and try and lie and misdirect to prevent his son from having to go. But in the end, he is the one who does not fight.
Yes.
And so on the last page, and this will be one of the pages I include with the art as well. So the last page of issue 1, you have the foreman who is leading now this group of children away. Everybody's got their backs to us on the page. We see Pigeon in his bindings, and he is the last of this line of children chained together, and he's walking off. And you have the image of Rokos up in the sun on the top. You see sort of like the mask that forms the part of his face where you can see his eyes and things, sort of overlooking these proceedings. And the foreman says, "One simple sacrifice." And that's where we're left with issue number 1. Jimmy, this is impactful.
Yeah, it's a great intro of what's going to happen to these children. Where are they being taken? How does this appease whatever it is that they're seeking? And how is this culture set up like this?
Oh my gosh, right.
What in the world?
It seems crazy. It seems horrible. All right, well, let's move into chapter 2 or issue 2. And my subtitle for issue 2 was On the Nature of Sacrificers, because there's going to be quite a bit of discussion among the sacrificers themselves, among these bound children, and in how their worlds are presented that makes us think a little bit more or a little bit differently about what it is that these kids are doing. So we open this issue with the foreman leading these bound children into a town in the middle of having like a community festival that is welcoming the harvest. And so while it was a very, solemn and grim and even a little bit confrontational scene in the last issue when the harvester showed up at Pigeon's house, here the harvester or the foreman and these children are welcomed with open arms. And it's like a great community festival that's going on. And this community is made up primarily of what I call like whale-headed people. They have sort of the heads of whales, but the bodies of humans. And their town is different in that they hold their sacrificer in the highest honor. They know that their sacrificer, in their point of view, is going to be doing a great service for the community. And so rather than isolating their sacrificer and ostracizing them, they are going to take that person and uplift them their entire life. So Noom is this character we're about to be introduced to, one of these whale-headed creatures who is a child who's going to be one of the sacrificers. Noom has been almost worshipped. She's been so revered. People are so thankful to her for the sacrifice that she's going to make, which is a very different experience than we had with Pigeon and his family, in that, she is thrilled to go willingly.
Yeah, so I referred to them in my mind, I guess, as the orca people.
Okay.
They look like orca whales to me. I don't know why that this just I don't are we ever told what they're
No, I don't think they're ever defined.
Okay. Well, and just immediately we're met with this difference in just name. Pigeon is pigeon. That is just it's his culture or whatever. It's his people. But these orca people, as soon as the temple opens, contrast that with pigeon growing up in a barn.
That's right.
This character emerges named Noom. And that word right there, as soon as I heard that, I go, oh, that's a Greek word. It's a variant of pneuma, which means breath, means spirit or wind. That feeling. The pneuma is Greek for breath, spirit, and wind, and it's life. It's a more fluid thing. It's something that maybe you feel, and it just gives this sense as Noom comes out, just kind of what it is that she's wearing, almost like priestly garments.
Yeah.
That it almost looks like she has wings. Just the way that they're draped down beneath her.
Yes.
And it's just a feeling of this is a parade. This is definitely significantly different than Pigeon when he was presented to the foreman, and the people cheer. And then there's this great page. You had talked about how you post things on Instagram, some of the artwork. As Pigeon sees this, the crowd chants out, "All hail the Messiah of Hope." And Noom is lauded for the sacrifice that she is about to make.
Yeah, there's this great splash page where it has that line, "All hail the Messiah of Hope." And Pigeon is standing there and he can't believe what he's seeing. It has this look of like just pure, I would say, joyous confusion on his face. And they are throwing like rose petals at him and showering him with them. And he's like, you also see that he's still wearing this drab, ill-fitting clothing that is tattered and dirty, and you contrast that with Noom. And Jimmy, that's so interesting about the name. I wondered, because I had seen that, like Sol Luna and that kind of thing, that these names had meaning. I didn't even think about, I don't know, I just took Noom as like, oh, that's an odd name. So interesting. And so this character is giving hope, giving life and breath to her community. And so, yeah, of course, she's a hero of this community. What a different way to view this world.
Yeah, and I think that's the contrast that they want us to see. And I think the conversation they want us to have is when you have this culture of sacrifice, some are going to view this as a negative. We don't want to hurt our family or hurt the sacrifice, so let's just keep them separated. And others will view this as a gift, whereas Pigeon saw that as his duty. The foreman says to Noom, "Do you give yourself freely?" And she looks up at him and says, "I do." This is almost like a binding in a positive sense, binding of saying, I'm prepared for this, as opposed to Pigeon saying, I'm forced into this.
That's right. I do it willingly because I know that my community depends on it, that it's to save the life of my family, versus the excitement that Noom has about doing this. I think this is brought into even greater contrast in the next few pages in this issue as we move along, and there are these other children that are already part of the, this like chain gang of sacrificers who are the two girls, or maybe one's a boy and one's a girl. It's a little hard to tell, but they are like rodent kind of people, and they, like Pigeon, had obviously grown up in a community that reviled the sacrificer, that exiled them. And, they talk about how, like, I was raised in a cage and lived in a cage my whole life. So they're sitting around this campfire at night. Apparently they've broken their hike or their walk for the day. And these kids are having the first opportunity to talk to each other. And the opposing ideas that these kids have about what it is that they're doing. Now, part of what we'll see, too, is they've been told different stories about what's going to happen, too. And that's something else that I think we ought to talk about, is like Noom says, and the other whale-headed or orca-headed child that came from that community as well, these two characters are talking about how, yes, the sacrifice we are making is that we are going into the land of gods, and so we won't get to be with our families anymore. But their belief, what they've been told about their future, is that the gods are going to make them the head of this, like, government of the mortals, essentially, that they'll be the stewards of overseeing the joy and prosperousness of the mortal realm. And, these rodent children are, like, screaming at them, like, you fools, we're about to be thrown into a volcano made of Rokos's fire. And poor Pigeon is sitting there, because I don't think he's ever been told anything about anything, except that he has to be sacrificed. And he is our blank slate character, seeing these opposing viewpoints.
Yeah, that's a phrase that I've heard, is that we are a collection of the stories we hear, and maybe even the stories we believe, and just their world picture, their world view, it's a good name, the rodent children, what they have been told and what they are expecting. So their visions are violence, their picture is death, whereas Noom has a picture of hope.
Yeah.
She sees this as an honor to do this. And then, as they're all getting a chance to talk together, they realize that how they have been prepared for this is significantly different. Noom has food for her journey, whereas everybody else, the rodent kids, have nothing, and Pigeon has this piece of bread that Beatrice gave to him.
Right.
And that's it. That's the fight, is how are you not prepared for this? And Noom seems a little confused that how have you not been prepared for this?
Yeah.
The provisions just aren't there for them.
Well, that's right. So their ideas about what they're doing are completely derived from their cultures and also from their upbringing. And both sides are defending them passionately, to the point where the rodent children start, like, attacking Noom and the other orca-headed child. And as much as I sort of appreciate Noom for her kind-heartedness, and, she wants to share this food that she has with all of the other sacrificers, and I think her innocence and her naivete are very sweet, they're also kind of condescending. She's saying, like, you poor rodent children who think, have this terrible dim view of our future and of the gods, because these stories have shaped their views of the gods. I mean, the rodent children have no love for the gods because their demand for a sacrifice has made their lives nothing but misery from the moment they were born. Whereas the orca-headed children, have this high view of the gods where they're like, we get to, Jimmy, this is actually something similar to what you said earlier, that we get to partner with the gods in making this beautiful, perfect world for the mortals.
Yeah, and Noom has a good line about recognizing that we're chained to show our devotion and respect to the gods, a metaphor. That's a great That's a great little line there of her recognizing this is a hero's journey that we're on. Mm-hmm. That's how she sees this, is we've been prepared for this. We've been given what we need to survive this. And now we're going to go through some tests. I mean, from her point of view, this is the hero's journey. And how many stories have we seen in comic books and movies and literature that it's just the hero's journey where they are tested? And the other people in the group are going, metaphor?
Right.
What metaphor? This is my life we're talking about here. This is how I have lived. I've lived chained. This isn't metaphorical. This is literal here.
Well, and I love that you point that out, because Noom is literally chained while she is describing it as a metaphor.
Yeah.
She has shackles on her arms and this iron binding that's pressing her arms to her torso, and she's saying this is such a beautiful metaphor.
Yeah.
So, and you're right. I mean, we see these stories played out in literature and in all types of culture and art. And so let's circle back now to talk for a second about some of these other tales of sacrifice that are just part of our culture, they're part of the waters that we swim in. And so let's start with the lottery.
Okay.
In this story, you have all of these members of a small community that are assembling for their annual lottery. And we don't know what the lottery is. We don't know what, you hear lottery, you think of a prize, you think of big money. And so I think that's the idea we're supposed to have going in. And there's a lot of anticipation. And there's a lot of pomp and circumstance surrounding the lottery and how they carry it out. You know, these traditions that they do year after year where a similar speech is always made and this same box is always used to put pieces of paper for every member of the community into the box that they're going to draw from for their lottery. And so it seems like something great is going to happen once somebody wins. And of course, what we learn, the winner of the lottery is the loser, because ultimately one family is going to be selected from the lottery, and then through sort of a second round of lottery drawing, one member of the family is going to be drawn as well. And then that member, we learn at the very end of the short story, is stoned to death by the entire community. What I think is remarkable about the story of the lottery is we are not ever told why this lottery takes place. So here in The Sacrificers, it's a similar idea of a story, but it's for a very clear reason. Whether the community embraces the idea of the harvest or accepts it begrudgingly, it is something that must happen to appease the gods. Whereas in the lottery, there are some references in the story to it being a bountiful harvest this year. And so I think it implies the idea that this is done to ensure that they will have a good harvest. But there's also this talk throughout the story about how in other towns they've stopped doing the lottery. And some of the older members of the community say, oh, these young kids who are foolish, have these foolish ideas that make them want to give up the lottery and our grand traditions. And when you see what a terrible thing that happens at the end of the story, this horrific thing, it makes you as the reader go, what is this wicked community that participates in this? Yeah. Especially when we don't know the payoff.
Yeah, and that's really good storytelling. I think both of us kind of noticed that this was in the 40s.
Yeah, 1948. That story was written.
And in the New Yorker, I mean, it's a short story. You can read it in 10, 15 minutes, maybe
15
something like
minutes,
that.
Sure.
And it's good storytelling because she just paints a picture of questions. As you read this and you're thinking, why is this happening? Tell me more about this community. But that's all you get. And then if I remember, where you actually learn what the lottery is just the last few paragraphs. Right. And that's the big turn, because that's the big question is all right, now that we've selected who wins the lottery, what do you win? What is it? And then all of a sudden there's a line in there, I think, and then they all like picked up stones or something.
Yes.
Or there was someone who threw the first rock.
Yeah.
And then you go, oh, this is not how I expected this to happen.
That's right.
Isn't it? It's interesting how sacrifice kind of keeps finding its way in our stories. Mm-hmm. Different generations, different cultures, but it seems like sacrifice is a continuous theme finding its way in, and that's just interesting. And this idea of somebody giving their life for the sake of the community is I don't know, it's one that keeps finding its way.
Well, Jimmy, these ideas do repeat in our stories, in our cultural stories, and in our religious stories. I mean, you can't read The Sacrificers and not see the story of Isaac and Abraham here. And so I do think we ought to talk about that one just a little bit from Genesis 22. And I will say that is a story that has been tremendously challenging to me as a Christian in my adult life. How I've thought about what that story says about God. And let me back up just a bit from it. So, of course, the story there is that God tells Abraham, take your son Isaac, this son that I have promised to you, and I have promised that I'm going to raise up a great nation through your descendants and through the son Isaac. Take him, and I want you to sacrifice him to me in a place where I will show you. And Abraham takes Isaac, and he takes two of his servants as well, and they just start walking. And they go this distance to this mountain that God shows them. I'll point out as well, and reading that story from a Christian perspective, it's hard to not see the allusions to Jesus as well, because so for 3 days they walk through essentially this valley of death before ultimately we know that God is going to deliver Isaac out of this peril of, it seems, God's own making. But nevertheless, we have the deliverance at the end of this 3 days. And so as they walk along after this third day and they've reached the mountain, you've got Isaac turning to his father, to Abraham, and saying, "Where is the sacrifice?" And Abraham just responds, "God will provide the sacrifice." And then they go on up, and we get to the point where Abraham lays the wood down, lays Isaac, binds Isaac, and lays him on the wood, and gets the knife, and he's ready to cut his own son's throat when an angel intervenes and says, "Don't do this, don't kill your son." And then there's a ram that's nearby, and that becomes the sacrifice substituted in the place of Isaac. And so in the New Testament, when this story is discussed in the book of Hebrews, the writer talks about it being credited to Abraham as an act of faith, that God instructed him to do this thing, and Abraham was faithful. And that's the lesson that we're supposed to come away with. I got to tell you, I have a very hard time seeing that lesson, because what I can't escape here is that God, in the telling of this story, commands this man Abraham, who God selected out of paganism apparently, and said, "I've given you this great gift of a son, and now I want you to kill that son and sacrifice him to me." And maybe even as a parent now, it's become even more stark than it was, before being a parent. But I think anybody can relate to this. The idea that even if God stops me at the last second and stays my hand, the trauma that I have just been put through, and look, I can only talk about this story through my own eyes and my own experience. Right. And I realize that an ancient audience would have seen this story differently. But the torture that both my son and I have just been put through by this ordeal, for me, that's a total deal breaker with that God. I can't worship that God that says, "The way you worship me, I command of you to sacrifice." And it's not so much even that I'm making a sacrifice, it's that I'm killing another live human being. And so that's a story I've wrestled with forever. I'd love to get your thoughts on it. So Jimmy, solve that for me.
What an easy one. All right. Well, first of all, you just used the word wrestled. And that, I think, is such a majorly important word for us to say, is that this is a piece of scripture that I believe we're supposed to wrestle with. Mm-hmm. I mean, how in the world can you read Genesis 22 and go, "Okay, well, that sounds like something God would do."
Yeah.
And I guess our job is to obey, and just whatever is put in front of me, I just do that and move on. Just as a human, as a dad, as a follower, that is really tough. And so we're supposed to wrestle. And I think the conversation we're getting into now, this is a lot of wrestling. And I hope that your listeners, that you are gracious to us as we're just kind of talking through things. Yeah. We don't present ourselves as experts on this. We're two guys who are trying to figure it out, and we're trying to be faithful to God, and we're also trying to figure out how this story here, this graphic novel that we've read, hey, what does this help us see and help us make some sense of things? This graphic novel that we're reading, we don't put it anywhere near Scripture, but it's obviously alluding back to these sacred stories that we know.
Oh, I mean, I think Rick Remender is commenting on the binding of Isaac.
Okay.
I mean, I really do. I think that he is intentionally retelling in a different way. This is my read on it. This story to challenge us to think about it maybe in a different way than a Sunday school way.
Yeah. Oh, that's totally fair. I struggle with the idea of reading Genesis 22 and then you don't really get much explanation until you get to the book of Hebrews, and there's that one verse that says, like, well, this was a test to show Abraham's faith, and you're like, well, that was written, that could have been hundreds of years after that. What did the people, when they first heard Genesis 22? I mean, this is for the Jewish people. This right here is an unbelievably important text. This is a text that they read every year. I believe
it's on Rosh Hashanah.
Rosh Hashanah is every year. This one is brought back. They blow the shofar, the horn, as a reminder of this story. And the name of this mountain, he names it Mount Moriah. Mm-hmm. The Lord will provide. Well, later on, historically, the city of Jerusalem is built on Mount Moriah. This is a sacred space right here in Scripture, and so this story comes back to so much, and we're going to wrestle with it. Sometimes in my mind I have this idea of like, well, we'll just go to the text, and whatever it says is just cut and dry, black and white. That's what it says. And I think as our understanding of Scripture grows, each of us individually realize like, this is something I'm supposed to wrestle with.
Yeah,
this isn't just so basic. I've struggled with all sorts of the books.
Yeah.
I mean, it's just, and this story in particular, is just tough. As far as making sense of it, again, I'm not an expert. Please show grace, give us the benefit of the doubt as we're just trying to figure this out. But I think that this story is revealing to us more of who God is. And it is a contrast to how gods have been presented in Abram's past. I see this story as a great contrast with Genesis 21, and that is the story of Ishmael being taken, Hagar and Ishmael going out into the desert. And there are just so many literary connections between that story and then Abraham and Isaac in Genesis 22. And we have to understand that at that time period, I think sacrifice, in particular child sacrifice, was a thing. Mm-hmm. And I think in that time period, we're just uncovering more things and recognizing, I don't think it was an absurd thing in that time period for someone to say, God has spoken to me and said that this is what I am to do.
Yeah, I understand the Phoenicians did a lot of this.
Yeah.
In the same time period.
Yep. And so I don't think that's that unusual. And that's what I think is the contrast. And I think this is why Genesis 21 and 22, that God put that in there, is that this is to show that this is a God who values these things. Ishmael, let me back that up.
Yeah, I'm sorry. What is these things?
The values life.
Okay.
Values children's life. Values the importance of the covenant that he has made previously with Abram. And even though Hagar and Ishmael in Genesis 21 are booted out, there's this scene where Hagar is out in the desert and she just kind of sets her son down. And I think he's age 13 at this time. And she just leaves him kind of to die. Mm-hmm. And God says, whoa. I'm not going to let this happen. Even though this isn't the kid of promise. This isn't the one that, this kid is a result of Abram and Sarah kind of doing their own thing. This wasn't part of the plan. I'm still going to take care of this kid. So Genesis 21, God is saying, I am not going to let this child perish out here in the desert. And then Genesis 22 comes along, and Abraham and Isaac go up on the mountain. This would be a thing, I think, in their culture that people would say, yeah, this is how the story goes. And you sacrifice your child up on this mountain, and you appease your God or the gods, and then you come down from the mountain. And what contrasts this story is that God stops him and says, no, this is not who I am. I needed you to see. I think he's already got his attention, but God is wanting to point out to Abraham, I'm going to take care of this kid over here, even though this wasn't necessarily part of the plan, and I'm going to take care of this kid over here. I am the God who recognizes life.
And Jimmy,
we could spend hours, right?
I could spend the rest of this day sitting here with you talking about this. But why don't we talk about the sacrificers a bit more? But I'm so glad, though, that we've spent some time kind of taking this. I wouldn't even call it an aside. I mean, I feel like this is sort of central to what we've got to talk about if we're going to talk about this graphic novel. Because I think this graphic novel is for the purpose of having this type of discussion.
Yeah, and that is I think a nod that we're both recognizing to the authors and the storytellers. Like, way to tackle a heavy subject and kind of get us thinking a little bit about culture and just that contrast of Pigeon's community that hides the sacrificer, and then Noom's character that praises and hails the sacrificer as the Messiah of hope.
Yeah, that's right.
Good contrast.
So as we move forward in our story now, we have the sacrificers all being led up this snowy mountain pass, which is another thing that looks exactly like, to my mind, a scene out of, the familiar Lord of the Rings type of storytelling. And they're all in their shackles and their chains still, and they're being driven up this mountain. and no one is enjoying it. Not, not Pigeon, not the rat children, not the orca-headed children. And yet they are responding still differently to it. There's a point where Noom falls face down into the snow, and Pigeon helps her up, and he says, "Are you okay?" And she responds, "Can't you see, Pigeon? It's just a test. A beautiful test of our devotion. You can see that, can't you?" And so she still has this hope. And, Pigeon doesn't know what to do with this. And she says, "We're almost there. You'll see." And her expectation is that they are going to be led to a land of paradise.
That's right. It's all a metaphor.
That's right. Still just a metaphor.
Hero's journey.
Well, they reach the top of this mountain pass, and it doesn't seem that they've arrived anywhere except on top of a mountain. And the foreman brings them all together and puts them, on their knees, tells them all to get down on their knees, and they've got bags dropped over their head. And I've seen some spy movies and stuff, and you usually don't want to have a bag dropped over your head if you can help it. And certainly that's the case. And we've got a couple of really neat pages where we've got like this 9-panel grid, except every panel is just black. And there are word balloons on the otherwise black panel, and it's the voice of the foreman, and he's sort of repeating what sort of reads like scripture again. And he's sharing this idea with them of this is a moment of the promises of the gods being kept, and that they're making this transition, and they're going to go to their next phase. And just as, I suppose we could have a moment where, I don't know, things could go good or things could go bad from the sacrificers' point of view. The bags are pulled off their heads, and now we are hit on this double-page spread with color and life. And frankly, we talked about Dorothy earlier. It sort of reminds me of the Emerald City in The Wizard of Oz. It's beautiful.
Oh, great. I thought of Wonka's Chocolate Factory when he opens up the doors and they go in that room that's just filled with everything's edible.
Wonka's Chocolate Factory scares me too much, so I'd rather think of the Emerald City. They have been brought to what, for me being the kid that was, 10 years old in the late 80s, early 90s, would have to be Paradise City, as far as these guys are concerned. And you have this little panel that's pulled out off to the side that shows the reaction on the faces of 3 of the sacrificers. There's one of the rodent children, and she is stunned, bewildered. She doesn't know what to make of seeing this beautiful scene with these waterfalls and, these pink flamingos, and it looks like rainbows and slides and a smiling sun and moon, being painted in different places. And there's food that she's not used to having, cornucopia, a literal cornucopia spread out on the table, and, slides and like a playground. And then you have Pigeon, he's literally got his mouth agape because he doesn't know what to make of this either. And you have this giant ear-to-ear smile on the face of Noom. And she says, "Just like I told you."
Yep, I was right. Ha ha ha.
But I almost don't even read it as so much of the, I told you so. Now, she's going to have one of those moments later. But for right now, I read it as like, don't you see? You finally see. We can share this joy together. And that is the end of issue 2. Okay, so that was part 1 of our 2-part episode on The Sacrificers, Volume 1, by Rick Remender and Max Fiumara. I hope you enjoyed today's episode, and I look forward to being back next week when we can do issues 3 through 6 that make up the balance of Volume 1 of that title. If you've got thoughts in the meantime that you want to share with us about this book or about any of the subjects we discussed, hit me up at graphicnovelapostle@gmail.com. I will look forward to seeing you next week, and until then, keep reading those comics.